Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Words of Life podcast with Kevin Bruni and Adam Kitt. Hey, this week's episode is going to be pretty awesome. We're going to be discussing the end of Hebrews chapter 4 and getting into Hebrews chapter 5. And we're going to be talking about Jesus and his role as our high priest. We're going to be talking about Aaron, the original high priest, versus Melchizedek, the even more original high priest. And then finally, another warning about maturity and our need for growth. I hope you enjoy today's study.
Sing them over again to me, wonderful words of God. Let me more of their beauty see, wonderful words of God.
All right. Hey, welcome back, everybody. Hope you had an amazing week, and we are super excited to be back with you. Kevin and I are no longer in summer mode. My kids back in school. Yours are about to go off to school again.
Yep. This week and next, yeah.
Yeah. I know Noah's first official day was technically last Wednesday, but they had like this flex start, and then our election was Thursday, and then he didn't have to go back on Friday because it was like a staggered thing anyway. So he really started today. And getting his classes all hammered out and stuff. Now, how many you're in the classroom and you got students already?
That's correct. They started last Thursday. We started Thursday, so Hudson River Company start. That short start just to make sure everything works okay.
Yeah.
And so we had Thursday, Friday, but today is the first real day where you didn't have a assembly that ate up a bunch of time, and this thing of people getting called out for student class level meetings and all that kind of stuff and rules and procedures and all that. So now we're really getting into it for real today, and tomorrow kids will do a pre-test to find out where they're at and stuff like that. So there's some real math.
That's really the smart way to do the start of a school system, really, because you're gonna either you start on a Monday. It's going to take you a couple of days just to get everything organized and all the kids going in the same direction. This is what to expect. These are our rules and all that stuff. You just get those out on a Thursday and Friday, have the weekend, come back fresh. You're in
ready to go.
Yeah, ready to go. Full stride. So that is great. So regarding our study last week, we ended in the unfortunate break of chapter 4,
4:13, right?
Yeah. Let me go ahead and pull up our text here. So we ended here. And I think it's really important for us to just kind of refresh our memories just to make sure we're all still going on the same direction together. We talked about the idea of entering into the rest of God and the children of Israel not doing that when they had the opportunity, when they left Egypt under Moses, and then Joshua, and then the conquest and things like that, and how God has set up a rest for us today that we have to look forward to. And the warning for us then is that we need to continually strive to enter that rest, because it's not just an automatic given for everybody, that we have to work at it. We're not going to earn it, but we are going to have to be obedient. And the idea of obedience is chock full all through there. But the last verse that we talked about is this idea that there is a reckoning going to happen. You and I joked about recalling Tombstone and Doc Holliday, saying, he's not going for revenge. It's going to be a reckoning, And that idea of a reckoning is that at the end of things, everything will be reconciled. That's where the word reconciled comes from, right? So reconciliation, meaning that God's going to look at the book of life, and if you've been covered by the grace of Jesus, He's not going to find any fault with your things. But we still have to remember that verse 13: no creature is hidden from His sight. All, like Adam and Eve were, are naked and exposed to the eyes of Him to whom we must give account, an accounting, a reckoning, all of these things. So we have that warning that we kind of just left with last week. And that sets us up for this next idea why don't you go ahead and take these verses here, Kev, and we'll jump right in.
Yeah, so because of that, right, because of being an accountant, then we need something in the way, otherwise we're going to have a problem, right? And so what we see here is verse 14. Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in a time of need. So we get this, as we kind of teased in the introduction there, this introduction, it's been mentioned before at the start of chapter 3, but nothing was built on it. It was just a title at that point. We get this introduction to Jesus as our high priest, right? And the kind of high priest that he is. So previously, remember, we saw that Jesus was superior to angels. Jesus was superior because of his humanity. Jesus was superior to Moses. Now we're going to start comparing Jesus to the high priesthood. And specifically, we'll see Aaron, but the high priesthood in general, Aaron will stand as a type for the whole high priesthood.
Right.
And the point the Hebrew author, surprisingly, is going to make is that Jesus is a superior high priest, right, as well. But first, he's got to introduce him as such before he can kind of talk about that. And so we see this contrast, kind of as you were alluding to, that there's this fear almost at the end of chapter 4. Right, that the word is sharp and it splits apart even the thoughts and intents of the heart. Nothing is hidden before the sight of God, right? And yet here, by the time we get to the end, it says we can boldly go. We can go with confidence to the throne of grace, right? And that seems like a very different sort of picture there, where we're going to find mercy and grace in our time of need. But why? Because we have this high priest, Jesus. Who's gonna sort of act as that mediator between sort of this severity of righteousness that's necessary for God and our human weakness, and he's going to serve in that role, and he'll talk about that more, as we said, weird chapter break as we push into chapter 5. But
and I think we'll take some time to dive into a little bit about the high priest and what that meant and why this idea of Jesus being a great high priest, what that has to do with everything, because the Hebrew audience understood the role of the high priest, but we don't necessarily. We didn't grow up with that. We didn't experience temple worship or any of those things. But the idea of the high priest, and why is he a great high priest? Well, he says he's passed through the heavens. No other man ever did that. No other man was the Son of God.
Right.
No, like when in chapter 1, when he was talking about the comparison to angels, to what angel did God ever say, "You are my son"?
You are my son, right? The answer is none, right?
None. So since we have a great high priest in Jesus, let us hold fast our confession. So we have another call to action here. Before we had, be firm in obedience. Now we're holding fast our confession. And what confession is that? Our confession when we come to the Lord is that we believe that Jesus is the Son of God.
Right.
We're confirming that. And we demonstrate our faith by submitting to baptism, which it'll get into a little bit as we progress. But Jesus, we have this great high priest who is able to sympathize with our weaknesses.
Yeah, so he's both things, right? He's passed through the heavens, and yet even though he's passed through the heavens, he's not far removed, right? And that's kind of what we saw in chapter 1 and 2. He's supreme because of his deity and also his humanity. And so we get sort of a callback here to that. He's passed through the heavens, his deity, and yet he has been tempted in every way like we are, right? He's able to sympathize with because of his humanity as well. And so he's kind of drawing those ideas of chapter 1 and 2 now here into a firmer conclusion or package, right? Those ideas are now expressed in his priestliness. He can relate to God and he can relate to man. So he's going to serve as this ultimate priest picture here for us. And because why he was tempted, but without sin. And so we can think of, the temptation accounts in the Gospels maybe as a type of that, but certainly, he faces other things throughout as well, right? I mean, even all the way up to the cross where he, he's being told by the people who are telling him there, hey, come down off the cross and we'll believe you, right? That's a temptation, right? Okay,
Yeah.
come down off the cross and be glorify yourself. Don't suffer this thing and we'll believe you, right? And he could have, but he didn't, because it wasn't the will of God. And so all the way tempted and yet without sin. But he knows what it's like. He knows what it's like to face the things that we have faced. And so 16, we can then draw close. We can draw with confidence to that throne of grace. And what we're going to find there is mercy to help us in our time of need, because Jesus has gone through those needs as well, is kind of the picture that he's laying out here.
So I was listening to the Unashamed podcast with the Robertsons. I listen to that from time to time. If you guys out there haven't watched that or listened to it, I highly recommend it. Those are the Duck Dynasty family. And if you didn't know, they are extraordinary Bible students. And they have some really, really, really in-depth Bible study conversations on their podcast. And they do 3 or 4 episodes a week. It's very robust. But they were talking about the book of Ephesians. And one of the things that they were bringing out is how important, and he actually talked about Hebrews and Ephesians when he was making this point, that how important it is to know the humanity of Jesus.
Right.
We don't talk about that enough.
Right.
We always try to reconcile the idea
Focus on his deity, right?
Focus on his deity, right? But God made mankind in our image, and our nature, in the beginning of our nature, is like God. Sometime along the way, our nature gets altered by sin, but Jesus came down and he experienced what it was like to resist all of those temptations and sin, and to suffer, and to be 100% human. And God made heaven for us, for humans, right? And it's really kind of, it's highly recommend listening to one of the latest episodes. But the idea that Jesus passed through the heavens, he humbled himself. We really need to dwell and think a lot about that, to appreciate how big of a sacrifice that was for him to make on our behalf, and for God the Father to promote and push and make that his will, that Jesus lived through all of those things for us.
Yeah,
it says here, he's able to sympathize with our weakness.
That's right. Yeah. And that's going to be important as we go into the next chapter. We'll see very quickly, because without that, he could not have been a high priest, because of the things that the high priest had to do. And that's what he's going to talk about. And so it's not just this, sometimes we think it's kind of a nice thing that Jesus has suffered the things, right? So he knows, right? Well, it's not just a nice to have, it's a must have. Otherwise he could not have acted as high priest. And so it's theologically important, right? It's not just doesn't matter. It's just kind of nice. It's a bonus. No. It's theologically important.
It wasn't a change of plans because of sin. It was always the plan.
The plan. That's right.
Right.
So we'll see that.
Imagine like drawing out plans for the future that involves sacrifice on that level. Rational people, right? Humans, we would say, nah, there's got to be a better plan.
Right. There's got to be another way.
There's got to be another way. Let's find out, figure it out, choose a different path. But God said, no, I love them so much. I created them to be like us, and I want them to live with us eternally. But humans have to choose to come to me.
Yep.
And the price for us to be able to be reconciled with God because of our lack of purity and holiness was his son, who we need to honor and love and thank every day, because he was tempted in every respect without sin. He's able to bridge the gap between impurity and ultimate holiness and purity, right? So then we can have confidence.
Right.
Where else do we talk about confidence a lot?
Yeah.
In our previous studies in the book of First John, right?
Yeah. Well, you can know that you know, right?
Yeah.
As you jump
You
back to
can
those
know.
places, you can know. And his
Yep.
point here is you can be confident that you're going to find the thing you need,
Yeah.
right? The thing you need, and this reminds me of even our Esther study, right? As you
Yeah.
sort of think about what's going on there. She's going in to approach the throne, right? And the throne of the sword. And she says, look, if I go in, I haven't been called, he can have me executed. And so she says, let's pray and fast. And she was not confident going in there. If I die, I die, right?
Yeah.
And what she found was mercy and grace,
Mercy and
right?
grace.
But she did not expect it necessarily, right? She said, if I die, I die. And the contrast here is we can go before the throne with confidence, boldly, because we know we're going to find mercy and grace there in our time of need, which is, it's an interesting sort of a picture. You sort of compare that, right, to a physical king and ooh, I don't know what I'm going to get. And here's saying, no, you know what you're going to get because you have this great high priest who stands between.
Yep. Absolutely. All right. Let's get into the official chapter 5.
Yes.
Right. It says for, right? What's the therefore?
Yeah.
For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. And no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So this is a good place to kind of stop and talk about the high priesthood, I think. So if you guys remember, or if you don't know, the progress of the nation of Israel, we've already talked about Moses and how he brought the people out from the land of Egypt, out of bondage there, and crossed the Red Sea to Mount Sinai, where the law was given. And Aaron, the brother of Moses, was the spokesman for Moses and for God through Moses. And Aaron, Moses' brother, was appointed as the first high priest. Now, when God gave the law at Mount Sinai, he brought down the 10 Commandments written on the 2 tablets of stone. But that wasn't just the whole law. That was just the 10 big ones, basically, right? The moral compass, so to speak, of the people. But God then continued to give them both a spiritual and a secular law to follow. And they built the tabernacle, which was the first tent where God said, I will make my presence will be there.
Right.
They built the Ark of the Covenant. That was a golden inlaid big chest with seraphim on top of it. They called that the mercy seat. And this big giant ornate lid with these angelic beings called seraphim. And in the tabernacle, and then later on in the future in the temple, there was an inner chamber called the most holy place, or the holiest of holies, where only one man could enter one time a year. And that man was the high priest. That man was appointed by God to act on behalf of the people. But he was a sinful man. He wasn't a perfect man like Jesus. So once a year, he would first have to cleanse himself. He would have to offer a blood sacrifice. Was it a lamb or a bull? I can't remember.
Yeah, back in the offering.
Yeah.
I'll check that.
Yeah. So the high priest would have to offer a sacrifice for his own personal sins, so that his sins would be officially cleaned, so that he would be holy enough and pure enough to then go in and meet into the presence of God, where the Ark of the tabernacle was, the Ark of the Covenant was, and he would basically then offer a sacrifice for the sins of the nation. And it would be an annual thing, year after year. And they would have, they had so many laws for sacrificing animals for the things that they did for benevolence and not for benevolence, for seeking benevolence from God for their sins. They also had a scapegoat, which I think will come up as well here in the book of Hebrews.
Much later, yeah.
Yeah.
And the heifer and all these kinds of things.
Yeah. So it was a code of religion that involved a lot of actions. But the high priest himself, his relationship was the access to God for the people for their sins.
Yeah.
And so you have this. I mean, I think I surmised it pretty well. What can you add there, Kev?
Yeah, so I think that's right. So you've got this bit, some of those things you had touched on. If readers want to look them up sort of later, Leviticus 9 is probably a place where you want to look and see this idea that he was, Aaron was appointed. God picked Aaron, right? You're going to be the high priest. When he originally gave him to Moses, he wasn't the high priest, right? But after the coming law, he said, Aaron, he's going to be the high priest, and his sons, and he picked, right? He chose from among all of Israel who would be the priestly line and who was going to be the high priest. And so that idea then of it says that Aaron didn't pick that. He didn't take it for himself. God called him to do it. And so we'll see that's going to be important in a minute, right? That just in the same way, Jesus didn't, right? Only because he was called by God. And then as you had sort of alluded to, it is a bull offering, that whole thing there about offering sacrifice for his own sins and for the people. You can read about that in Leviticus chapter 16. That's where it breaks down all the sort of things about what we sort of call Yom Kippur now, right? The Jewish sort of system. But this whole layout of the things that were done and the releasing of the scapegoat and all these things, and him offering a bull for his own sacrifice and his own household first, is kind of what's being referenced sort of in that place. He's obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins before that. But sort of the key thing here is that he was from among the people and he could deal gently with people because he was human, right? And so that thing we saw in the end of chapter 4, that Christ can sympathize with our weaknesses, that's a picture of the high priest, right? So it's very important when we look at Hebrews. There's all these things that happen in the old law, and it was very important that things were sort of made according to the pattern. You'll read that over and over and over again in the old law with the tabernacle. Be sure to make it according to the pattern. Be sure to make it according to the pattern. And, we'll sometimes draw interesting parallels from that. But the important thing about that, the most important thing that God was trying to lay down is because you have to make it according to the pattern, because these things are copies of the heavenly things. Right. So he was all the way back there saying you have to do it according to the pattern because I'm going to use this much, much later. Way down, thousands of years down the road, I'm going to use this to make a point about the heavenly things. And one of those things was set up the priesthood this way and do it this way, right? Because the Hebrew writer thousands of years down the road is going to say, see how Jesus matches that up, right? And so here he's doing that. He's called from among the people. Oh, Jesus was called by God. We'll see in a minute. He can relate to the people because he was a sinful man. Well, Jesus can relate to the people because he was tempted in all the ways we were yet without sin, right? The priest relates to things concerning to God. Well, Jesus did as well because he was divine and because he passed through the heavens, right? And so all of these things are important pictures of the work that Christ is going to do. And that last one there, which we'll pick up here in verse 5, no one took this honor upon himself. No one could just decide, I'm going to be the high priest, right? You didn't do that. But only when they were called by God, just as Aaron was. And that's where he's going to pick up on verse 5 here. Here's the call of Jesus.
Real quick though. You also oftentimes hear the word or the phrase Levitical priesthood. That's referring to the tribe of Levi. You often say it's the 12 tribes, but it's really the 13.
Yeah, it's interesting as it breaks down, right?
Because you have the two sons of Joseph in there, and anyway, but
half tribes and all this jazz. But
but the tribe of Levi, the family, all the descendants of the man Levi, and Aaron, right? He was in that family. So would Moses have been, by the way. Right. The tribe of Levi was dedicated to being temple and or tabernacle and or all of the religious ceremony.
Yeah. Certain
Right?
things they had to do.
Yeah, and so they were dedicated to taking care of all of the physical aspects of the religion, the law of the religion that God was going to be giving them. And so the Levitical priesthood. So you couldn't be a priest unless you were from the tribe of Levi, and you couldn't be a high priest unless you were of the lineage of Aaron,
Yeah.
and then chosen by God.
Yeah, and that's interesting as well, right? Because we'll call the Levitical priesthood or the Aaronic priesthood, right, after
Yep.
Aaron himself. So you may see that term used or thrown in there, especially in your Bible, right? The Aaronic priesthood, if you've got these headers.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's the priesthood that comes from Aaron and his sons, right? Is
Yep.
sort of the way that goes. But again, they didn't pick it for themselves. God picked them. He chose them to do that.
Right. So go ahead and pick up there right there in 5.
So maybe
how was Christ chosen?
Tricky place to go here. Let's go maybe 5 through 10 because we'll get into this warning here. So in verse 5, so also, right, just like Aaron was, so also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." As he says also in another place, "You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered, and being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So there's a lot of things going on there, but let's sort of break it down a bit at a time. That the first part is, so Christ, so the Christ, so the appointed, anointed one, so Jesus, right? He did not exalt himself as high priest, but it was only because it was the will of the Father. God called him. And so he says, right, to the Son, "You are my son, this day I've begotten you." We've seen that already, but here's a new reference to that one. He says, "You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." And so let's take a break there. We'll circle back to Melchizedek a lot more later. So let's not get too into that.
We won't get too into the weeds on Melchizedek, but
Chapter
I will
7,
say that Melchizedek is one of the most fascinating characters you read about in the Bible.
Yeah.
Partly because there's so
little
said about him.
Yeah.
And yet it's such a profound reference.
Yeah.
That we're seeing here.
And more is said about him later than it is even in the Old Testament, right? That's what's super interesting about him. And most of it's in Hebrews here. So
so if you want to do some research for yourselves, y'all, Genesis chapter 14.
Yep.
We're going to find the reference about Melchizedek. And I'll just give you some real quick context. Is during the time of Abraham and his nephew Lot. And as they were traveling through the area, and Lot was eventually going to be settling into the area of Sodom and Gomorrah, where she chose the green land, right? Anyway, so Abram, still called Abram then, there were all these kings of these small little, we would call them like, tribal chiefs, basically.
Sure, right, yeah.
Right? It wasn't like giant, kingdoms. But you have like the king of Gomorrah and the king of Sodom and the king of all these other places. Well, they had a big battle, and Lot and his family got captured, basically. Okay. And long story short, Abraham goes in and saves the day, and gets everybody returned and all that stuff. And you just have this really quick, this guy called the king of Sodom. The king of Salem shows up, arrives on the scene, and his name is Melchizedek.
Yep.
Right. And his name, and it says, he was priest of God Most High. It's the first time we have anybody called a priest of God.
Right. Yeah.
In the Bible, right?
Yeah.
This is
predates
hundreds of years prior to Moses and the issuing of the law and everything, right? So this is way back. We have this guy, the king of Salem, which means peace. So he's the king of peace, right? Showing up, and Abraham recognizes Melchizedek as somebody that absolutely outranked him. And Abraham offers a 10% of everything that he has in honor of this, And so we have this order of priesthood that predates Aaron and the Levitical priesthood. One reference, one guy,
Right.
one story. We don't have any context whatsoever for him. We don't have any lineage. We don't have any history. We have nothing else that we know about him other than God recognized him as a
story.
priest.
Yep.
And a king.
Yeah.
So that sets up this other priesthood that Jesus falls into this category. So
yeah, and that'll get talked a lot about in chapter 7 when we get there.
Yes.
But here he just makes the reference saying, to the readers, well, when was Jesus called to be a priest, right? And the answer that the author is giving us here is, well, here, right, in this other place. This other place is Psalm 110. If you're trying to figure out what is this other place that's referenced, it's Psalm 110.
Yep.
So Psalm 110, he cites, "You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." And if you go and you were to read that psalm, it's clearly messianic, and we know it is because Jesus will actually reference it as well. So Psalm 110 starts with, "The Lord declares to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet," right? And remember, when Jesus is on the earth and they're talking to him and asking him questions, he says, "I have a question for you," right? And he responds back with this thing about, this Messiah, the Son of Man, whose son is he, right? And well, the son of David, right, is the answer. And he goes, well, then why does David say,
Yep.
the Lord said to my Lord, right? The Messiah is my Lord. He's greater than me. He's, not my descendant. He is, but he outranks me, right? And so
I'm pretty sure Peter also referenced that verse in his sermon on Acts 2, didn't he?
Yeah, and so we have this sort of reference here where this idea gets pulled out with this son of. He'll use it to say the enemies being your footstool, right? In Acts chapter 2, and that enemy is death and these kinds of things. But so we know that that's what that is about. They don't say that's not messianic. They knew it was messianic as well, right? And so what we know in that psalm is the Messiah, this Christ to come. In that psalm, as you go down to verse 4 in Psalm 110, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. So God had proclaimed that about the Messiah to come, right? And so now the Hebrew author is saying, see, the Messiah, the Christ, was called by God to be a priest, right? That it's in Psalm. Go look it up, right? He points to that as his reference in his text. And so what he's saying is, just like that, the Christ, Jesus, did not exalt himself as high priest. God had already done it before he ever showed up on the planet in physical form, way back when David prophetically said this thing, that you are a priest after the order of Melchizedek. And so that's how he establishes he's a priest. And then he goes, well, what did he do? Right? And he's drawing this picture, if you will, between some of these other things that we're going to see, that he offers gifts and sacrifices, but his gifts and sacrifices in the flesh, where he offered up prayers and supplications to God, the one who was able to save him, and he was heard because of his reverence. And so we see Jesus acting in that priestly role. And again, we're going to get a lot more information about that later, about him offering sacrifices and what sacrifice he offered and those kinds of things. But right now, he's just introducing the idea of Jesus as priest, Jesus as high priest. It's not after the Aaronic priesthood, it's different. But we knew that Christ was supposed to be of this other priesthood way back before Jesus ever showed up, right? And then he's going to say this really interesting thing, right? That he, even though he was the son, he learned obedience through the things he suffered. And because of that, being made complete in that way, through his suffering, he was made complete. He became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey, because he was designated by God a priest after the order of Melchizedek. And so I think what he's talking about there is that up above, right? Up above, we saw that the priest had to relate to man. He had to understand his sufferings. And so he says here, Jesus learned some things through his suffering, right? He learned about obedience to God, not his own obedience, but what it means to be a human in obedience to God, right? And he learned through his suffering. He was made completed in that. So he could be a priest. He could be the author of salvation. Why? Because the priest has to relate to man as well as God. And so through his sufferings, he was tempted in all ways as we were, right? He knows what you go through. And so because of that, he became perfected or completed in that. And that's why we see it's so important, the humanity of Jesus. Without it, he can't be the high priest. If he doesn't suffer, if he doesn't experience humanity, he cannot be the high priest because he cannot relate to man. He can only relate to God. And the priest has to be able to relate to both. That's his job. That's his role.
Well, I think that when you think about these verses here, right, and that you talk about Jesus praying, loud cries and tears, and learning obedience through suffering. Well, I'm immediately taken to his final visit to the Garden of Gethsemane.
Yeah, in the garden, sure.
Right, and there's the garden scene where Jesus is crying. Take this cup away from me, and yet he was suffering through all of that. He knew it was coming. The mental and emotional agony that he was suffering is clear. And yet he said, "Not my will, but yours be done." And so that is the evidence of his obedience, that he went through it, that he allowed it to still take place, even though he didn't. That wasn't his will at that point. His 100% humanity didn't want to do any of that stuff, and yet he resisted the temptations of calling it quits, of throwing in the towel, of calling down 10,000 angels to rescue him. Right. He resisted all of those things and proved his obedience through his suffering. Now, this idea here, do you have any other translations pulled up, Kev?
Sure. What do you want?
Well, in verse 9, being made complete, you use the word complete a lot, which was oftentimes what the word perfect means.
Yeah.
To be made, to become perfected.
Yeah.
Is a better way to understand it, right? Or being complete, being 100%, being the job is done, so to speak. He became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, right? But being made perfect, when did that happen? He wasn't made perfect as an infant human. Well, I mean, he was sinless.
Right.
At what point did he become complete? Right? And you can probably point to several instances where that might be appropriate, but I think is when, honestly, when he was ultimately raised from the dead, overcoming death, and from after the 3 days, when he arose, that was it. His job was done. Basically.
Yeah. And I think you could argue, and again, we sometimes really slice and splice the crucifixion and the resurrection, where a lot of times I don't know that, I mean, they're different events, and yet it's all sort of a thing, right? You can't really take them apart in the way that we like to apart. So sure, the resurrection is fine, or the crucifixion itself, right? This idea of, especially here, we would say what was lacking, right? What was lacking from Jesus, in as much as, and again, understand my language, right? We're speaking in human terms, as Paul would say. What was lacking from Jesus before he comes to earth? What was lacking is the understanding, the experiencing, let's say it that way, the experiencing of human suffering, right? Yeah. And so it says he becomes complete. He becomes perfect. He's the thing which was missing is now supplied when he suffers, right? It's in the suffering. So we could say the crucifixion is the thing which brings completeness and fullness to what he has to do, right? And like you said, using that completeness, Jesus himself on the cross will say, "It is finished," right? It is finished. It is completed. It is done, right? Yeah. All things are now as they ought to be. And then the resurrection is sort of the justification that he was who he said he was. It's the proof that he wasn't making it up, if you will, right? But you can't have one without the other, really. Yeah. But yeah, that's really what the Hebrew author in this case is really driving on.
Well, and obviously the Hebrew author was writing this post all the events.
Oh yeah.
So regardless of
he's been made complete.
The nitpickiness that we like to do sometimes,
right?
when Jesus is now at the right hand of God.
It's
Period.
been done. It's done. Right.
It's all in the past.
That's right. Yep.
He was made perfect. He became the source of eternal salvation.
Yeah.
For everybody.
Yep.
Who obeys.
All who obey.
Come back to obedience again, right?
Yep. And so he really kind of does a nice job. Again, I want to say wrapping up, but really just introducing that Jesus is this priest. He's a high priest.
Yep.
I'm going to talk more about it in a minute.
Yeah.
And if we want to look at these next couple of verses, we can at least look at 11 and maybe we'll pick back up here again next time, because he says about this. We have much to say, and it's hard to explain, right? So about this whole Melchizedek thing, and
why
all
is it hard to explain?
Yeah, we've got a lot of things to display. We have a lot to say about this, and it's hard to explain because you become dull of hearing, right? Which suggests to us, at least, that he wants to talk more about it, and he's going to, right? This is not a thing. If you kind of pull this out of context, you think, oh man, there's a lot more cool stuff here, but I can't talk to you because you have so many things in the way. But that's really not what happens. He's really just going to lay a warning on him for a minute. And then he's in chapter 7, he's going to be like, okay, now let's talk about it. Right. Exactly. And so you could almost say he really wants to just take out this whole part and just talk more about Melchizedek.
Before I go there, I really want to talk to you about something.
Right.
That you need to hear first.
And you got to move on.
I got to get this off my chest or whatever. Right.
Well, I'd be talking about it right here. We wouldn't even need this part except I got to warn you about this sort of apostasy, or this warning against dullness of hearing, or like we might say, because he's going to do all of chapter 6. This warning on immaturity is probably an easy way to summarize that. This warning on immaturity that he's going to give them there. But he's telling you, I'm not done talking about Melchizedek. We're just going to take an aside for a minute so I can give you a warning. Then we're coming right back to this because there's a lot to say and it's tricky to understand, right?
Yeah.
So
let's just touch on this really quick, and we'll pick up and probably expand on this a little bit more next episode.
Yeah.
But he says there, you become dull of hearing. Picking up in 12 is for though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the basic principles of the oracles of God. You need milk, not solid food. For everyone who lives on milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, since he is a child. But solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. So here he has this great these pictures, right? You have children and adults. You have solid food and milk. These two contrasting concepts. Of course, then you always have good and evil at the end. And so the idea here is that, hey, most of you reading this, you've been really lazy, basically. You've been really lazy. And instead of growing like you should, like the expected human does, from baby to adult, you've maintained your infancy.
Yeah.
And that's not right. You should be way ahead of where you're at. You should be teachers. You should really know all of the basic oracles of God, and that you should be able to, by practice and by hard work, being able to preach the righteous principles of God. So,
yeah. And again, he's just going to build on this as we start. It's just another weird chapter break, right? Like you could have put the end of 4 at the beginning of 5 and moved the end of 5 to 6, right? Just slide everything a couple of chunks, and it makes a little more sense. It's like they've put the transitions, which is fine. They've put the transitions effectively in the previous chapter to keep you moving, right? Ooh, but look, there's more. Keep reading. There's more.
There's more. And one of the purposes of this podcast for everybody is, I started out just reading the Bible,
right?
Which was an amazing, wonderful gift for me personally. I got so much out of it, and I'm really glad that there were so many people that tuned in and paid attention. But we're trying to live this.
Yeah, let's do a little more digging, right? Yeah, that's
right. We're trying to get into the meat of the word. And so I hope you guys appreciate that. If there's anybody out there that needs more of the basics, we could also maybe go there. So we're open for doing what we need to do on this channel to help as many people as possible to find the Lord and find Jesus and grow your own faith and grow in maturity and all that. So, what do you have to say, Kev?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to end it right there, right? If you got any questions about those things, that's great. He's gonna talk about this need to mature, and that's what we're sort of doing here. But we need to understand as well as we're looking at this, especially Hebrews, right? This is a book for the mature, right? This is a book for those who want to understand some not first principles kinds of things, right? And in here, he's really laying those out because remember these warnings he's given, right? This danger of neglect, this danger of unbelief or of hardening the heart, and now it's this danger of remaining immature, right? He's trying to move people along to be more grown up Christians, right? More people that are growing into the picture of who Jesus was.
Yeah, and there's so much to gain by doing this.
Yep.
And he's already alluded to so many of them, but we can have confidence to enter the throne of grace and throne of the Lord and find grace and mercy in our time of need. And that's what we're all striving for. And we hope you are too. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. Like and share and all that stuff. And until next time, may God bless you. Hope you have an amazing week.